Tim, going through the first 7 presidents, if they were alive today, could be magically brought here, what advice would they give to a President Biden or a President Trump?
Oh, man. That's an interesting question, because I would also think, what advice would they give to the American people? And I think probably, and it might be very similar to a Biden or a Trump, but I think they would look at Biden and they might call him King George IV, right? I mean, it's so fascinating. If you go back and read the Declaration and all of the reasons they thought we should separate from the King of England, it's what we're doing in America right now. Everything our federal government is doing are the things that they said, we recognize what the rights are that God gave, that there's a divine creator, and he gave rights to man, and government shall protect those rights. And they start listing all the ways the king was violating those rights. And if we look at what the federal government is doing and violating our rights, according to what the founding fathers understood are God-given rights, and they even acknowledged that there was a laws of nature and nature's God, that there was a fixed moral code and standard, and we are seeing that violated in so many respects. But where I think it's such a difference in America as opposed to King George, I don't think they would say, we need another American Revolution, because they would look and go, wait a second. You mean you were voting for some of these people? Yeah. You were choosing some of these people? I think they would encourage our leaders to understand their position, that they outline in the Declaration that to secure these rights, governments exist among men. The reason our government exists is to protect and defend our God-given rights, which really goes back to a biblical perspective. The Bible outlines government exists to reward the righteous and punish the wicked. The number one thing government does. Well, the government also exists to protect their people, which if you go back and read and study your Bible, one of the very common things from the Bible, in fact, where wall builders gets the name wall builders, the story of Nehemiah, how do they protect people? They built walls at times to protect the people that lived in their land. Walls are not an unbiblical thought. In fact, it's one of the most biblical thoughts that a government can do to protect their people. And if we start looking, what is the ultimate role of the federal government? It's not to run our lives. It's to protect our God-given rights, to allow us the freedom, the opportunity to live a life according to what God has called us to do. So I think the advice they would give to the president is to recognize your role. Also understanding the Constitution, it gave a specific listed out powers of what the federal government, of what the president can do, of what Congress can do. And they would remind them, right? You can only do these things outlined in the Constitution, and you're trying all these others. That's not how that works.
Well, here's the difference. I can't speak for President Biden. I've never had a chance to meet him. I've never had a conversation. But his supporters decry the notion that God has given us rights.
Right.
And so government can't violate rights if government gives you rights.
Right.
It's impossible for them to violate them. And it's impossible for government to be limited, like you just said. You know, people ask me, can the federal government print unbacked currency? And the founders all hated paper money. Jefferson said paper is poverty. It's the ghost of money, not money itself. Washington said, paper money will have the effect in your state that it has always had, which is to ruin commerce. That's what he said. So why do we print unbacked paper money? Well, the reason is the founders, the Constitution was not written to prohibit the federal government from emitting bills of credit. They prohibited the states. And I read the debates. The reason for the debate was, well, we don't have to prohibit it. We didn't give them the right to do it. Therefore, it doesn't have to be prohibited. Why should Governor Morris stood up against paper money and convinced them. And they said, well, do we have to prohibit the federal government? No, of course not. It's not been given to them as an authority.
And Jefferson was so brilliant on this. So he's interesting where Washington and Adams did things. Jefferson actually became a very strong opponent toward the end of his presidency, or not his presidency, toward the end of Washington's presidency. He was still serving under Washington. He became a strong opponent of George Washington. Said, I don't support what you're doing because you are doing things the Constitution didn't say you could do. Well, the Constitution, and this is where I would argue, okay, I think there's some allowances for what you can do. But to Jefferson's point, Jefferson said the president can only do the specific things Constitution says he can do. And so even, for example, Washington, and this is still the example, but it's very accurate to what Jefferson thought and believed, Washington and Adams both did presidential prayer proclamations calling on the nation to pray. Thomas Jefferson did prayer proclamations when he was governor of Virginia.
Right.
But when he was president, Congress called on him and said, hey, we want to do another day of prayer and fasting. He said, president can't do that. Constitution doesn't give me the authority to do that.